Dr. Mearsheimer, what does being a contrarian mean to you?
It means challenging the conventional wisdom. I think one of the principal reasons we have freedom of the press is to allow to ask tough questions because this is essential for preserving democracy. And I think academics are given tenure so that those academics can speak truth to power, so that they can challenge conventional wisdoms and not be punished. So I think academics, by their very nature, should be contrarians, and I consider myself to be a contrarian par excellence.
So, after the collapse of the USSR, definitely a more optimistic outlook for international affairs was gaining ground in the West, with authors like Francis Fukuyama, claiming that we had reached the so-called end of history. At any point during that period, did the tide of academic discourse ever make you question your convictions regarding offensive realism and the nature of interstate relations?
No. My view is that as long as states operate in an anarchic world where there's no higher authority, and where states can never be certain about the intentions of other states, it's almost always going to be the case that realpolitik or realist logic applies to state behavior. I think there's no question that at the end of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union badly crippled, it was unlikely at that point in time that you would have any serious security competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then, of course, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, we were clearly in a unipolar world. And in a unipolar world, by definition, there's only one great power. So you really can't have great power competition.
Yeah.
So I think that realism was somewhat ameliorated during that period. But I never had any doubts that given we lived in anarchy, that realism would continue on.
So at this point, it really seems as though, we were speaking about this earlier, that we're seeing a backlash to, that liberal hegemony, which kind of, I guess, peaked during the immediate post-Cold War period. Do you view this phenomenon in a positive light? And I'll go a step further, put another way. Do you think that a more realist West will be less likely to act as irreverently as we did, with regards to things like NATO expansion in Georgia and Ukraine?
Well, my view is that the United States adopted a policy of liberal hegemony soon after the Cold War ended. And it was very much a non-realist. Indeed, I think one could argue it was an anti-realist foreign policy. And the name of the game was basically to spread liberal democracy all over the planet, and to even be willing to invade countries for the purposes of toppling authoritarian regimes and making them into liberal democracies. This has proved to be a disaster. I think one of the principal reasons that Donald Trump was elected in 2016 was that he ran against liberal hegemony, and I think that his arguments resonated with a large portion of the American public, and that helped to count for his getting elected. The question is, what does the future hold? I think it would be very good for the United States if we could move away from liberal hegemony and adopt a realist foreign policy. It's interesting, but most people think that realism is a theory or is an ideology that encourages war. And the more realist the state behaves, the more likely it is that you'll have war. And the more liberal a state's foreign policy is, the less likely it is that you'll have war. I think that exactly the opposite is the case. And I think if the United States had not adopted liberal hegemony when the Cold War ended and had instead adopted a realist-based foreign policy, that the United States would have been involved in many less wars over the course of the past 25 plus years. And in fact, I think that's going to happen anyway, in large part because of the rise of China. I think that in a unipolar world where you don't have great power competition, realism is not going to matter anywhere near as much as it will matter in a bipolar or multipolar world where you have great power competition. And with the resurrection of Russian power, with the Russians coming back from the dead and the continuing rise of China, we're basically transitioning from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And I think that realpolitik or realism will come back with a vengeance in this new world.
Harping back to NATO, what are your biggest concerns with America continuing to support NATO in its current capacity? I know you've sometime, after the fall of the Soviet Union, for example, you suggested this disbanding of NATO. Can NATO still further America's strategic interests, or, as the president would say, is it obsolete?
Well, I was in favor of pulling American troops out of Europe and putting an end to NATO when the Cold War ended. I was a strong supporter of NATO during the Cold War. I thought it was imperative that the United States be in Europe to lead a balancing coalition to contain the Soviet Union. And I think NATO did an exemplary job at accomplishing that task. But once the Soviet Union went away and the Cold War ended, I think there was no longer any reason for us to be in Europe. Of course, we didn't leave Europe, we stayed, and in fact, what happened was that NATO expanded eastward. There were two great expansions, one in 1999 and then another one in 2004, and I think they were unnecessary, number one, and number two, provocative towards Russia. And I thought it was a bad idea. And I thought during that entire period, the United States should still get out of Europe. I think today, with the rise of China and the need to pivot to Asia to contain China, I think it's imperative that the United States leave Europe and put an end to NATO. But it will be very difficult to do that because many people have a deep-seated interest, and especially the Europeans, in keeping NATO alive.
Interesting. Well, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Miles.
Okay.
So, as you mentioned here, the grand strategy the U.S. has pursued in the last, several decades has been one of liberal hegemony, which you write means that the U.S. must use its power not only to solve global problems, but also to promote a world order based on, among other things, representative governments and respect for human rights. But the fact that the U.S. very clearly cares more about respect for human rights in certain countries than others, doesn't that suggest in itself a more realist foreign policy?
No, it's a more hypocritical foreign policy. The fact is that the United States has not pursued a realist foreign policy since the Cold War ended. We've pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, which is a thoroughly liberal policy. And we could get away with it in part because of the fact that it was a unipolar world and the United States was not engaged in great power competition. What happened here is that the United States decided that its principal mission underneath liberal hegemony should be to spread liberal democracy all over the world, because we believe that the more liberal democracies there are on the planet, the more peaceful the world would be, the less human rights violators there would be in the system, and the more secure democracy would be. This was their thinking. But in the process, two things happened. One is we did make exceptions, as you point out, and there were some thugs who we supported. For example, in Egypt, there was an election after President Mubarak was overthrown, and the Muslim Brotherhood won that election. And for a while, the United States was willing to live with that, but then the United States became discontent with Mohamed Morsi, who was the elected leader, and the United States basically gave the deep state in Egypt the green light to overthrow Morsi. So we were acting quite hypocritically. But it's important to understand that at the same time, there were many places, especially in the greater Middle East, where we were trying to topple regimes and promote democracy. But there the problem was we failed at almost every turn. All you have to do is look at what happened in Afghanistan, look at what happened in Iraq, look at what happened in Syria, look at what happened in Libya. The United States seemed to have the Midas touch in reverse.
And I think it's safe to say the main people who have been pushing this grand strategy has been the foreign policy establishment, both on the left and on the right, or as Ben Rhodes called it, and as you referred to it earlier, the blob. What exactly is it that gives the blob so much power now that they've transformed Obama into the candidate of change in foreign policy, into generally an establishment figure when it came to the decisions he made, as well as Trump, who ran against the foreign policy establishment, but now seems to...
Well, the reason that the blob, or the foreign policy establishment, is so powerful today and is able to basically transform candidates for change who get elected to the presidency, like Barack Obama and like Donald Trump, is the fact that there is so much unanimity across the political spectrum within the blob itself. It's commonplace in a lot of the media to talk about the Republicans and the Democrats as if they had significant differences about foreign policy. The Republicans like to portray the Democrats as soft on foreign policy and unwilling to do all sorts of things that the Republicans would otherwise do. But this is a myth. The Republicans and the Democrats, when it comes to foreign policy, are basically Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They both support liberal hegemony. They both support a highly militarized foreign policy that is designed to remake the world in America's image, which is another way of saying toppling regimes and replacing them with liberal democratic regimes. And because there is that consensus at the elite level, it is almost impossible for a new president who is elected, right, on a platform of change, and this would include Barack Obama and Donald Trump, to contest the blob and to alter that foreign policy in any meaningful way.
And so my last question, moving to what a realist foreign policy would look like in actuality, you've said in the past that while you prefer to limit nuclear proliferation as much as possible, you would still show restraint in invading and occupying countries, such as today Iran and North Korea, in order to prevent them from acquiring a nuclear arsenal. How do you strike the balance?
Look, there were a good number of hawks in this country who argued that the United States should have gone to war against Iran at some point after the 2003 war against Iraq. Iran obviously had this huge nuclear infrastructure, and these hawks argued that we should go in there and bomb it, destroy it. But the hawks admitted that even if we did that, we would only be buying ourselves 4, at the most, maybe 5 years without the Iranians developing a bomb of their own. In other words, you couldn't go in and destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure and guarantee that they would never get nuclear weapons. The hawks admitted that you would buy yourself time. You would destroy that infrastructure for a fixed period of time, maybe 4 years, maybe 5 years, but then the Iranians would develop the bomb. And not only would they acquire the bomb, at some point they would be mad as hornets, so that if you ever got into a crisis, or the Israelis got into a crisis with the Iranians, it would be a very dangerous situation. Just to go back to the case of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union tested its first bomb in 1949, and as you know, the United States had a nuclear weapon as of 1945. So we were the only power on the planet until 1949 with nuclear weapons. After the Soviets tested their first bomb in 1949 and began to build up their arsenal, we contemplated the possibility of going in and attacking their nuclear infrastructure and destroying their capability to build the bomb. Now, there was no question we could do that. But the problem that we faced was it was not a long-term solution. It was just a temporary solution. The Soviets, even if we destroyed their nuclear infrastructure in, say, 1951 or 52, would eventually rebuild it, and they'd get the bomb, and they'd be as mad as hornets. And it was for that reason that we did not launch a preventive war against Russia's nuclear capabilities. And I would apply the same logic to Iran. If you could convince me that we could take out Iran's nuclear capability once and for all, as an American, I might be willing to do that. But you can't convince me of that. And again, the hawks were not maintaining that we could do that. And absent the capability to take out their nuclear infrastructure once and for all, it's a fool's errand to go start a war against them. That's the Iran story. North Korea is a fundamentally different case today. North Korea has nuclear weapons. And if we attack North Korea, certainly if we invade North Korea and we put its survival at risk, that's the one scenario under which they're likely to use nuclear weapons. And it would be remarkably foolish, in my opinion, for the United States to invade North Korea. It would be remarkably foolish, in my opinion, for the United States to even attack North Korea with military force, because North Korea has nuclear weapons. And not only does it have nuclear weapons, it has thousands of artillery tubes located just north of the DMZ that can hit targets in Seoul, South Korea. And half of South Korea's population is located in the greater Seoul area. And there are hundreds of thousands of Americans there as well. So they have not only nuclear weapons they can hit us with, they have thousands of conventional weapons they can hit us with. And furthermore, the Chinese have said if the United States attacks North Korea, that's the one contingency under which the Chinese will come in to back the North Koreans. And if the Chinese come in and the Chinese have nuclear weapons themselves, who's to tell what the escalatory dynamics will look like? So this is a very dangerous situation. So North Korea is a place you definitely don't want to attack. It's a much more dangerous situation than Iran. But as I said, with regard to Iran, even there it makes no sense to attack Iran. The best way to deal with the nuclear proliferation problem, both with regard to Iran and North Korea, is not to present a serious threat to those countries, and therefore to take away the incentive that they have to acquire nuclear weapons. The problem that the United States has is that it runs around the world threatening regime change. And therefore, it gives these states very powerful incentives to acquire and to keep their nuclear weapons. I often say that if I were the national security advisor in North Korea, I would never give up my nuclear weapons. And if I were the national security advisor in Iran, we would already have nuclear weapons. Now, is this in the Americans' interest? No. The United States has a vested interest in creating a world where one power has nuclear weapons. One power, us. But that's not the perspective that the North Koreans and the Iranians have. They understand full well that had Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, the United States would not have invaded in 2003. They understand full well that Colonel Gaddafi would be alive now had he not given up his WMD programs earlier in this century.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so Barry Posen at MIT has a great article called The Rise of Illiberal Hegemony in this month's Foreign Affairs. After analyzing Trump's foreign policy, he asks, is U.S. hegemony of any kind sustainable? And if not, what policy should replace it? What would you say?
Well, my argument, John, is that the United States should be able to maintain its position for the foreseeable future as a regional hegemon. The United States is a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. I believe, however, that no state on the planet, including the United States, can be a global hegemon. The best you can do is to be a regional hegemon. And the problem that the United States has faced since the end of the Cold War is that it has tried to achieve global hegemony. Because liberal hegemony is all about global hegemony. And that is not going to work in a world where nationalism and realism are powerful forces and where other states will resist American encroachments. So pursuing global hegemony, whether it's of a liberal sort, which is what we've pursued, or an illiberal sort, which is what Barry Posen sees Donald Trump doing, is guaranteed, in my opinion, to end up as a failure.
Let's jump to Korea. Recently, China has increasingly driven a wedge between the United States and South Korea, a relationship that is definitely one of the more solid ones out there. By acting as an offshore balancer, is the United States not also becoming a more distant ally for South Korea?
Well, first of all, I don't think that China has driven a wedge between the United States and South Korea. I think the United States has driven a wedge between South Korea and the United States. And what the United States has done is that it has scared the South Koreans half to death by threatening to go to war against North Korea. The South Koreans do not want a war. on the Korean Peninsula. South Koreans do not want the United States to attack North Korea. The North Koreans also do not want a war on the Korean Peninsula, and the North Koreans fear that the United States might attack them. So what's happened here is that the North Koreans and the South Koreans are now talking to each other. And the South Koreans are leading the charge because the South Koreans see this as a way of forcing the United States to back off from its threats to attack North Korea. So it's the South Koreans talking to the North Koreans and the North Koreans talking to the South Koreans, which is all designed to keep the U.S. military at bay. And this is all due to the fact that Donald Trump has been remarkably threatening in his rhetoric when it comes to North Korea. And I actually think the Chinese do not play a large role in this situation. Now, with regard to offshore balancing means that if the regional countries that are threatened by China can protect themselves from a Chinese attack, the United States should stay offshore. In other words, if China's neighbors can take care of their own security, the United States should stay offshore and remain as a backup. However, if China's neighbors cannot, among themselves, put together an effective balancing coalition to deal with China, then the United States has to come onshore. This is what happened in the Cold War. We were an offshore balancer during the Cold War, but we actually had to come onshore into Europe. This is what NATO was all about, because the local European great powers could not contain China by themselves. Same thing is true in East Asia. So the United States is not going to be off in the distance. It is going to be onshore. It is going to remain in South Korea. It's going to remain in Japan. And with the pivot to Asia, it will move more forces into East Asia. The problem with the United States is not that it's backing off, that it's going offshore, because offshore balancing in this contingency requires going onshore. The problem with the United States is that it tends not to behave in a smart way, and it tends to scare our allies. And this gets back to the initial part of your question about the South Koreans and the North Koreans. The fact is, the Trump administration, because of its rhetoric, not because it's threatening to leave East Asia, but because of its rhetoric, scared its ally, South Korea. And we have scared the Japanese as well. And the end result of this is the North Koreans and the South Koreans are now talking as a way of keeping the Americans from launching a war.